Our committee's numerous reports are available on our website, and I would note that our report on transnational repression was referred to extensively in yesterday's House of Lords debate on the National Security State Threats Bill, and that our report on supply chain transparency and modern-day slavery was referred to by members of the House of Commons during their Westminster Hall debate on June the 18th, and both of those transcripts are available on the Hansard site. We will also be having a full House of Lords debate on that report on Friday, September the 4th. Meanwhile, we're nearing completion of other reports on children in social care and their human rights, and our inquiry into artificial intelligence and human rights. Today, though, we return to our inquiry entitled Security, Safety and Protest, the Role of Human Rights. This second oral evidence question session will examine how protest powers are applied in practice, focusing on how policing professionals interpret and implement the current legal framework when managing protest. It will explore how officers balance the duty to facilitate a peaceful assembly with the rights of others, including how key thresholds, such as serious disruption, are understood and actually applied on the ground. The session will be framed by established human rights standards, in particular Articles 10 and 11 of the European Convention on Human Rights, on freedom of expression and assembly, alongside the rights of those affected by protest activity, including the right to respect for private life under Article 8. In doing so, the session will gather evidence on the operational impact of recent legislative changes, including the use of preventative powers, stop and search, and protest-related offences. But it will also explore whether the current legal frameworks provide sufficient clarity, consistency, and safeguards to support proportionate policing, and how factors such as training, guidance, and resources shape decision-making in practice. Before I introduce our illustrious panel, I should remind members of the committee, but also the panel, about the sub judice rule. As members will be aware, the sub judice resolutions of both houses mean that live legal cases should not be discussed in parliamentary proceedings. So I would ask members and witnesses to avoid referring to any live legal cases in our discussions today. So let me tell you something about the illustrious police officers that we have with us. We have Claire Haynes, who's the Detective Superintendent at the Metropolitan Police. She's a senior policing leader within the Metropolitan Police Service with more than 30 years of operational experience. A highly qualified Gold Public Order and Police Safety Commander, she's directed the strategic and operational delivery of numerous large-scale and high-risk public order operations across London's most challenging environments. And that includes leading the operational planning and delivery of the Notting Hill Carnival, the world's second largest street festival, necessitating the deployment of over 7,000 officers each day. With a strong background in frontline policing, she brings a community-focused approach, balancing robust operational effectiveness with the principles of community-led policing to strengthen public trust and confidence. She works closely with local authorities, emergency services, and national partners to ensure preparedness, to enhance coordination and mitigate risk across major incidents. She also has a background in covert and firearms policing and is accredited as a Gold, Silver and Bronze Public Order Commander, as well as a Gold CBRN Chemical, Biological, Radiological and Nuclear and Multi-Agency Incident Commander. You're very welcome. We have Chief Constable Mark Hoborough, who's the lead for public order at the National Police Chiefs Council. Chief Constable Hoborough has over 30 years service. He joined Gwent Police in 2020 and became Assistant Chief Constable in January 2022. His background is especially relevant to public order, protest, firearms, counter-terrorism and major incident command. He's a trained tactical firearms commander, hostage negotiator, specialist strategic firearms commander, Gold Public Order Commander and Gold Chemical, Biological, Radiological and Nuclear Commander. Chief Constable Hoborough has led or supported major policing operations, including high-profile events the Commonwealth Games in Australia in 2018, and Gwent Police's COVID-19 response as Gold Lead in 2020. Within Gwent Police, he's led significant operational reform, including roads policing and specialist operation, changes to uniform policing, and the creation of new units such as an investigations hub, file management unit, and virtual response team. Most relevantly, he leads several National Police Chiefs Council portfolios, including public order and public safety, which involves working with Home Office and partners on the policing response to protest and disorder. He was the lead for Operation Lest in 2025, overseeing policing responses to immigration and asylum-related protests. You're very welcome. We have Assistant Chief Constable Claire Arms, who's lead for public order, public safety tactics, training and equipment at the National Police Chiefs Council. She was appointed Assistant Chief Constable for Local Policing and Prevention in March 2025. She began her policing career as a Special Constable with Devon and Cornwall Police, where she spent the majority of her service before transferring to Avon and Somerset Police on promotion to Chief Superintendent, where she's had a wide range of operational and strategic roles. Assistant Chief Constable Claire Arms has developed significant national experience through secondments. She works with His Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary and Fire and Rescue Services, contributing to police effectiveness, efficiency and legitimacy, and more recently led to command training for senior officers at the College of Policing. She is a highly experienced Gold Public Order and Public Safety Commander, Strategic Firearms Commander, and is also trained as a Gold Chemical, Biological, Radiological and Nuclear and Magic Commander. That, I'm told, means Multi-Agency Gold Incident acronyms. She's had the opportunity to work with a number of international policing partners, including the British Overseas Territories, and has supported leadership developments and capacity building initiatives across the Middle East, North America, the South Pacific and Australia. You're very welcome indeed. And now we turn to our Assistant Chief Constable from Merseyside Police, who is online from the great city of Liverpool. This is Assistant Chief Constable Jennifer Wilson, Public Order Lead of Merseyside Police. She joined Merseyside Police in 2000 and was appointed Assistant Chief Constable in February 2025, with responsibility for response and resolution matrix and force operations. As part of the new operating model with effect from the 29th of March of 2026, she is the Assistant Chief Constable responsible for contact and crime management, matrix, force operations and criminal justice. Assistant Chief Constable Jennifer Wilson enjoyed a varied career, starting in local policing and response before moving into investigations, and then became a qualified detective before gaining promotion to sergeant, moving back into uniformed roles within response and community engagement in St Helens. Upon being promoted to inspector, she performed the role of critical incident manager in Knowsley and local policing before attaining the rank of Chief Inspector Operations Support within Knowsley. She later worked with corporate support and development as part of the project team to deliver the force functional model before taking up the role of Superintendent Criminal Justice, Superintendent Knowsley, and latterly before promotion responsible for criminal justice, local policing and prevention, and she was head of professional standards, anti-corruption and vetting. Assistant Chief Constable Jennifer Wilson has undertaken the Executive Leadership Programme at the College of Policing and also a Strategic Firearms Commander, Gold Public Order, Public Safety Commander and Chemical, Biological, Radiological and Nuclear Gold Commander. Clearly we are extremely privileged to have 4 policing professionals with such extraordinary experience to come and give us the value of what you have seen, what you've heard, what you've experienced on the ground in your roles. So I'd like to ask a scene-setting question, if I may, before turning to my colleague Sir Desmond Swain, who will ask the second question. And my question to you is, when dealing with public protests, what are the principal harms that police are concerned about and seeking to prevent? How do police determine where the balance should lie between tackling those harms and facilitating protest? And what role would you say human rights play in that determination? Would you regard a protest that proceeded peacefully and safely, but did cause, for instance, significant public disruption, as a successful policing outcome? And why would that be, or why would it not be? So who would like to start off with an answer, and we'll perhaps go through each one of you in turn.
I think, Lord Dalton, if that's okay, I'll make a start in relation to this, giving a bit of a strategic oversight of it as a National Police Chiefs Council lead on public order, public safety. I think we've seen very emerging different challenges in the arena of protest and in public order itself. For a variety of reasons, which I know everyone will be aware of. It's become more dynamic, more fast-paced, less centralised, and something which we're having to adapt to very quickly. I think it's fair to say that the oversight that I've definitely fed through to all commanders across the whole of the UK is that it's really important for us to keep that fundamental right, that great British principle of having the ability to legitimately protest over things in the right arena. But obviously, with the changes that have come into place with some of the things that we've seen over recent times, it's about keeping that balance of the rights of protest and also the rights of people to go about their lawful daily business. And so operating in that arena is becoming somewhat more challenging and somewhat more subjective in relation to people's viewpoints. Now, very much we welcome some of the changes that have been put into place through the Police and Crime Bill and some of the proposals. But I will say that even those don't actually resolve some of the issues that we've got, because I think it's really important that we as police chiefs and gold commanders and commanders right across the public order arena operate in a way that's really considered, really tries to have a bearing of consideration for all parties, is consistent, and that's challenging because what's acceptable in one part of the country can be less acceptable in another due to capability and capacity issues. So getting that right is really difficult. And it does. We are working in an arena where we are not able to get a wholehearted agreement from all parties that taking action or not taking action or taking retrospective action is the right thing. So it is an increasingly difficult scenario to work in. I think for me, it's about command and communication being consistent as best as possible. And really trying to operate in that way. But I don't know if you want to add an operational context to that, Claire, maybe from what the Met are seeing at the moment?
So look, I think when you talk about capability and capacity, obviously London as the capital city experiences protest probably more so than most of our colleagues and forces around the country. When we talk to the disruption of London, I think there's an expectation that there will be an element of disruption in London. Our communities are used to that, whether that's right or wrong, our communities are used to it. I think the context we've been operating in the last few years has been unprecedented with the size and scale of some of the protests that we're now seeing. If we think back to September last year, we saw a right-wing protest that reached in excess of 150,000 people in London, and despite the best efforts of policing or legislation, an element of disruption will always come with that size and scale of protest. And as colleagues have explained already, that balance of the right to protest versus the right to go about your lawful business is one that we have to really look at carefully and manage carefully, which is why we use conditions to restrict some of those protests, to try and minimise that disruption. It's why we work with our partners, our local authorities, our transport networks, to try and understand the impact on them, and then use the legislation that's in front of us to try and minimise that impact. But the protest that I referenced in September is only a small part of what's been happening over the last few months and years. We've had, as you would have undoubtedly seen, a number of national call-outs from Palestine Solidarity Campaign. We've had 34 large-scale marches in London since 2023, and that's only one thematic of what we're dealing with in London as the capital city. But I don't know how, Claire, you feel from a slightly smaller force perspective.
Thank you.
Please.
I probably wear two hats today, Lord Alton, and you will hear from the largest force in the country and the second smallest force in the country, which I represent, being Warwickshire. However, in my role as the national lead for training, tactics and equipment in public order, public safety, we are starting to see some benefits of the legislation. And I don't think it necessarily makes things more complicated for policing. It gives well-trained, accredited commanders a far broader range of considerations and matters that they will need to carefully work through with their partners, with their communities, and that will be very different compared to what we experience here in the capital to much smaller county forces.
Thank you, that's very helpful. Let's go to Assistant Chief Constable Wilson now to hear a view from Merseyside. And then as we go into more granular detail, perhaps we can return to the sub-clause of my question about what does constitute a peaceful outcome, a good outcome as far as the police are concerned. Please.
Thank you, Lord Dalton. So colleagues have already alluded to our positive and negative duties and the balance that absolutely needs to be struck. For me, whilst there's lots of legislation and Claire's just alluded to it again, that gives commanders a real choice and set of considerations. Now, I wouldn't want anybody listening to today's proceedings to be mistaken or misled in the sense that we don't ever use those powers lightheartedly. They are given careful consideration. Our commanders are trained and accredited to adopt a structured approach, and it very much centres, particularly here on Merseyside, around engagement with event organisers. And that is also one of the challenges, because in legislation, certain bits of the legislation require an individual to take accountability for being the organiser, and that is not always the case. So, that engagement is paramount. And, certainly here on Merseyside, we successfully engage with event organisers to have those conversations so that we can really consider, how we respect the right to protest, but also absolutely maintain focus on upholding the rights of others to go about their lawful daily business as well. But it is a very careful and fine balance.
We've got a supplementary question, if we may, before we turn to Sir Desmond Swain. Dr. Peter Swallow would like to just pick up the point that's just been made.
Assistant Chief Constable, you mentioned just in your answer there that it can sometimes be really unhelpful when members of the public are not aware of what the rules are and how that can sometimes create tensions. I just happened to spot on social media last night a video of a person talking about it being illegal in the UK now to have a flag on you, for example. How are you finding some of the misinformation and disinformation that is out there on social media and elsewhere about what the actual rules are about protests? How is that affecting your ability to have those conversations with organisers in a responsible way?
Yes, so thank you for the question. So sometimes we will, through police liaison teams, have a particular point of contact within a group. But as soon as you start to ask specific questions about whether or not they are the organiser, quite often then, because of the understanding that they have around the responsibilities within legislation, they will then say, I am not the formal organiser, I am just engaging with you on behalf of a broader group. So two distinct challenges really. One, in terms of who is the organiser of some of these events, can be really challenging to pin down. Your second point over the management of social media, mis and dis and malinformation, absolutely critical for policing to get ahead of those challenges and make sure that the communications are really, really effective. That goes back to understanding your local communities, having, built relationships with key networks. And we do that really well here within Merseyside. So often in the past, we have stakeholder briefings. We will hold meetings online where we will communicate key messages to members of the community for wider dissemination. And we will use other methods such as, different social media platforms to really highlight our key messages and make sure that we are myth busting or challenging any mis and disinformation that may exist. And we've used that to good effect in the past. But, you know, the speed of social media and how that information can gather traction remains a challenge for police in the UK.
Thank you. I guess that colleagues will want to return to that question, partly around the training of police officers, and I know my colleague Baroness Hamwee wants to ask about that in due course, so some of your own colleagues here on the panel will be able to add to what you've just told us. But now I want to go, if I may, to Sir Desmond Swayne, Member of Parliament, before we turn to Baroness Hamwee.
How confident are you that the threshold of serious disruption is consistently interpreted across forces? And are legislative attempts to define it welcome, or do they merely constrain operational decisions?
I think that might be best to start at training, Claire, possibly with what you've engaged with the College of Policing.
Thank you, sir. So thank you for the question. We don't have colleagues here from the College of Policing today, but I think it's important to recognise that training, guidance, legislative updates are all owned and designed by the College of Policing, and we work really closely with them to make sure it's accurate, it's up to date and cascaded throughout the country. We have a really strong cadre across the country of gold, silver and bronze commanders who are required to carry out mandated CPD training and also maintain an annual accreditation. How we do that is through learning from examples across the country, paying close attention to things that are particularly happening in the capital and elsewhere, seeking feedback, working with partners and building that into our learning. One of the challenges that we face is that more legislation doesn't necessarily mean that we need to use it, because should we be in a position where any of our commanders would perhaps put some restrictions on an event or a protest, we still need to be able to have adequate resource to be able to police that effectively and keep people safe. Commanders will always be guided by community impact, by intelligence, by the threat, the risk and the harm, and that will vary across the whole of the country. So what is vitally important is that commanders are using the frameworks that they are trained to use. They're cognizant of the legislation. They may not get to the same decision, but when you look at the disparity across the country in the size of force and resources, that may not always be a negative outcome. It's important that they use the framework that underpins the legislation and their training and guidance.
If any of your colleagues want to chip in now on that, Chief Constable Hobart?
Thanks, Aldo. Yeah, thank you, Claire. I think in relation to your question, Sir Desmond, from the operational context and the confidence aspect, I would add to the fact that there is definitely a discrepancy in certain areas of how things are used because of the context and because of capability and capacity within forces and resource levels. So there are some of those things, and even with some of the figures that we measure in relation to the use of things under the Act, they only record when restrictions have been put into place. So we don't. What's not being collated at the moment is the number of protests that we've had where those restrictions have not been put into place, or where they've been considered but not used. So I think at the moment it doesn't fully show the full range of considerations that a commander would have when they're faced with a set of scenarios.
Is that the situation in London too, Superintendent Hayes?
Very much so. I think certainly when we consider any kind of cumulative impact of disruption, what does that look like, how does that feel, we will do a continual assessment of what that means for London, what does that mean for the capital city, what does that mean for our communities, and as has been described by colleagues on the panel, just because the legislation exists, it doesn't necessarily mean we invoke it, but we will constantly assess what we're seeing in front of us using all intelligence that's available, looking at the threat, harm and risk of what's occurring, and make those decisions using the framework to underpin all of our decisions across every protest that we manage.
Thank you. So let's go, if we may, to Baroness Hamwee, and after that we're going to hear from Lord Sewell.
Thank you. To continue on the theme of training, Chief Constable Hobart, have I pronounced that right? You use the terms fast-paced and dynamic, and as well as applying that to actual protests, you might apply it to the legislation, which has felt from this end to be quite fast-paced. we've passed new specific powers, there are new offences, they come in almost every policing bill. So I wanted to understand a bit more about the training that officers receive. I take the point about gold, silver and bronze commanders being accredited, but how does that work on the ground? What training do other officers, lower ranked officers, have on the law and on guidance? Because they're not quite the same. How is it all kept up to date, and how do you satisfy yourselves that it's effective?
Thanks, Baroness. I think I'll allow Claire to add on to what I'm about to say, but I think what I would say, what I'm reading from that is you're on about non-specialised public order officers, so the standard officers who are entering the organisation.
Yes, the people who actually are seen by the public as carrying out the law, and who may be drafted in from other forces, of course, particularly in London. Yeah.
So they're forgive me if you know all these details already.
Well, no, it's all right to get it in as evidence.
There are different levels in relation to PSU training. So the officers who are deployed to conduct, let's call it, everyday public order duties, so serials that would go on mobilised duties across the country, are trained to a criteria in line with the APP, and they would be level 2 officers.
That's an authorised professional practice.
Sorry, yes, my fault with the acronym. And then we've got a higher level of training again for level 1 officers. But the standardised officers that you're talking about, probably the rank and file really across the whole of the organisations, are trained, many of them are trained up to level 3, which is a basic level of dealing with elements of disorder, but not in the way that maybe we would picture the escalation with the full kit. So it does form part of every force's basic training of their officers, and it is revisited on a regular basis. Claire will know the detail on the annual accreditation and things like that.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Baroness. So just to add further, you're absolutely right. Training and guidance is ever evolving. Much is policing, and at times it's very difficult to keep up. However, just recently we have run a series of knowledge sharing events, which are national events for anybody in policing, led by the College of Policing. They are uploaded onto a secure knowledge hub that can be accessed 24/7 by anybody who wishes to view them. The accreditation period for commanders is mandated between really about December and April each year, and we are able to feature common themes, so it's perhaps not unexpected to realise that this year there is a heavy a heavy influence around the new legislation. One of the challenges that we do face is around consistency, which you have alluded to. So the College of Policing play a role in carrying out regular moderation visits of the licensed training centres across the country that deliver training to those officers that you will see on protests and events day in, day out across the country. The purpose of those visits are to ensure that standards are being met. We work very closely with the National Police Coordination Centre because it's important to make sure that people who are deployed have the right level of training and accreditation, so there is no risk. And we are constantly seeking to increase the numbers, so to ensure that we've got the right level of capacity and capability. Anybody who doesn't meet the standard, we're able to put some more intervention training if that is necessary. And the protest operational document has recently been updated. It's well used in the public order, public safety world. So together we are constantly involving the training, and from my perspective as the national lead, I play very close attention to make sure the standards are met, and there is a range of learning methods for everybody to have access to.
Well, for the purposes of our report, that's a very comprehensive, very helpful reply, but I think you've got a quick supplementary.
Well, just very quickly, at the beginning of that, you mentioned resources being available online for anyone who wants to use them. And you keep on, that sounds like there's personal discretion in that, but presumably you keep on top of that to ensure that they are being used.
It's through registration, yes, and the reason I say perhaps any time is because a large proportion of our officers who work in this space will work 24/7 shifts.
Yeah.
So we try to ensure they've got access to training materials that can fit around their, their working requirements as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, Lord Dalton, do you mind me just adding, because
Okay.
at the very start...
I'm just very keen that we should, in some cases, bring people in again where they can add something more to in answer to other questions. But let's do that now on this, please, Chief Constable Holbrook.
Thanks a lot. Sorry, Baron. So at the very start of your question, you made the commentary, which is understandable, about the fast-paced dynamic changes that have been made to the Act as well. I do agree with you, but I think we're working in unprecedented times. I know we've already talked about this malinformation, what we now call information disorder, because it's got such a context of public order. I think some of the tactics that we're seeing are coming at pace, and some of the changes that have been made to recent legislation to address lock-ons, tunnelling, new tactical things that protesters are doing have been really welcomed by policing to give us those options, really.
Yeah, that's very helpful, thank you. So we're going to go to Lord Sewell now, and after that we'll hear from Dr. Peter Swallow, Member of Parliament.
Yeah, good afternoon. My question is really around the tension between human rights legislation and I suppose the reality of violent demonstrations that you would encounter. So, for example, how do police take into account human rights when demonstrations become violent? And then to what extent can the rights of a peaceful majority be upheld when a violent minority engage in behaviour that falls outside the protections of ECHR Articles 10 and 11?
I'll bring Claire in a second on the operational context of that. I suppose, Lord Sewell, what I'd say is over a number of years now, what we've tried to do within our training, sorry Claire to come into training, what we tried to do very much is make sure that we treat different groups differently, so we don't have a group dynamic on all protesters and treat people exactly the same. We try and identify those individuals who are more at the higher end of risk and violence so that we can take a tactic which is proportionate to address that and look after public safety, whilst allowing often the vast majority of people to be able to protest legitimately. So having that ability to differentiate between different groups is something that's really been drilled into our staff and is very much part of our continuous professional development and annual training to ensure that we're able to tackle those issues.
No, I'd like to bring in, if I may, Assistant Chief Constable Wilson as well on this before we come back to colleagues who are here in the room. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yes, so just building on the answer of the Chief, absolutely critical that our staff recognise there will be groups within groups, and it isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. And this comes back to capacity and capability and threshold. So locally, despite being a metropolitan force, we are really, really small geographically, which means that our staff have a really good understanding about what normality looks like in that particular community, which helps them then work through the proportionality decisions in terms of any dynamic intervention or action that needs to be taken, and when that tipping point or threshold is met. Because failure to act properly can, of course, lead to an escalation, which puts the wider public at risk. So we do expect our officers to make dynamic decisions based upon the information that is in front of them. And a key element of that is about picking a proportionate tactic with the minimum use of force possible so that they can address that problem to prevent a worsening for everybody else. Now, sometimes that may mean dynamic arrest and intervention there and then. Other times it may be more proportionate to evidence gather and prosecute outside of that environment. And again, it all comes down to what resources you have available and whether you've got the capability in terms of the public order resources to be able to manage that without exposing other members of the public to harm. Because for every arrest that you make, you will lose 2 or 3 resources from that public order operation, which means that they are not then available to respond to everything else that may occur. So a fine balanced decision and can be tricky for commanders.
Thank you, that puts it very well. Lord Sewell, do you want to come back in on this?
Yeah, I mean, this is a slightly provocative question. I mean, we may have, in the future, a government that doesn't want to have ECHR protections anymore. Are you happy with that?
I think policing, having been in policing for 31 years, I've seen different administrations, and I think the way that policing manages things and looks after people, which is what and looks at our core responsibilities, doesn't change regardless of administration. I think the aspects of doing the right thing long term will be embedded within policing, and I think those sort of matters will be discussed at Chiefs Council as to how we can ensure that that is very much verbalised and demonstrated on a regular basis, regardless of whatever political parties in power. I think the policing core responsibilities are there to look after people.
Thank you. I think you've clearly differentiated between the role of the police and the role of Parliament in making the laws, so thank you for that. Let's go to Dr. Peter Swallow, and after that we're going to hear from Mr. Afzal Khan, Member of Parliament.
And Chief Constable, that's a really helpful place to pick up on for the question that I want to ask, which is really just a reflection on the incredibly challenging environment that I know the police sometimes face when they are managing a protest or a demonstration. You may have thousands of people at one of these demonstrations sharing their views enthusiastically, displaying banners or slogans, and many of those, the vast majority, may be doing so peacefully, lawfully. And then there is always the challenge that I know the police have to weigh up very carefully, which you've already all spoken about, where a very small minority may be going beyond the law as it suddenly stands. How can police officers ensure that line is properly drawn between legitimate lawful expression and criminal behaviour? And does the law as it stands currently allow that differentiation to happen in a live in a live situation, in a way that allows at times the uncomfortable but nevertheless the lawful expression of people's democratic rights to take place without preventing you from doing the difficult job that you have to do to step in when it does cross that line?
Chief Constable.
If it's okay, I actually think that there's a live example that Claire can provide from what the difficulties that the Metropolitan Police had to manage in a recent event, and the way that they involved criminal justice partners to be able to navigate some of that difficult territory. And then I was able to get that communication out across the country as well, if that's okay, Claire.
Superintendent Haynes, I think the ball is yours.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the question, Dr. Swallow. So I think the example that the Chief is referring to will be an event most recently on May the 16th in London, which I'm sure you've seen, you would have heard, in relation to two very opposing groups being in the centre of London, two very large-scale demonstrations, both of whom opposing views, both potentially with views that are in opposition to the wider community and the impact that it would have. And so our job is to manage, as we discussed here as a group, balancing those rights of people to lawfully protest, looking at what perhaps is grossly offensive versus what is an offence, so where is the criminal offence is being committed, using the powers that are available to us to intervene in those instances, and that comes back to the training, that comes back to understanding the framework, the legislation that we're working in, officers stepping in. The threshold to arrest, as we know, is different to a threshold for prosecution. So officers exercising and using those powers as they did on May the 16th. We made in and around 40 arrests, 20 of which were hate crime on that day. And that's by officers being proactive and being robust in using the legislation. You will know the difficulty officers face when they're standing in a very dense crowd to necessarily see and or hear some of those chants, some of those slogans. We also know that the impact that social media has, and we saw it on that day with much of those slogans and chants being repeated on social media, and then we are looking to pursue those individuals who are committing crimes online, some of which being utilised in the way that we've discussed around information disorder. So in terms of a difficult and complex situation for our officers, I think that's a really clear example of how we've had to balance that democratic right to protest, what our communities feel is offensive to them versus what is a criminal offence, and how we balance the needs of the community with the needs of those protesting in order to maintain and keep the peace across London. And I think we managed to do that on that day effectively.
There are those who see the way that the police respond to situations like that, including, it has to be said, senior politicians who have significant roles in this place, see the work the police do in instances like that and claim that it is two-tier policing. Do you accept that criticism?
No, I don't accept that criticism. From my perspective, it doesn't reflect how officers make their operational decisions. We police without fear or favour. We make decisions based on threat, risk and harm, for intelligence, through an evidence base, through community impact. We don't make those decisions based on ideology or cause or ethnicity. We encourage our officers to police to the law, use the legislation, and I think sometimes that two-tier narrative is perpetuated by those in the public eye versus media versus protest organisers, all who have perhaps a different agenda to that of policing. So I do reject that as a suggestion and very much believe that we police without fear or favour.
Thank you. My colleague Alex Sobel, Member of Parliament, wants to ask a supplementary on this before we turn to Afzal Khan.
We have this very difficult issue around policing Palestine protests, where, and I just want to be careful here in how that people may use phrases similar to the name of group which is prescribed, and I just want to know how you judge how to police those and when to make arrests. Maybe that's probably one for Detective Superintendent Haynes as a Metropolitan Police, mainly Metropolitan Police issue.
So I do think we need to be clear around Palestine Action versus other protest groups that protest under the banner of Palestine Coalition or Palestine Solidarity Campaign or offshoots of a variety of Palestinian causes. I think, as we've mentioned before here, it's policing's job to enforce the law. We don't make the law. Palestine Action as a group are a prescribed organisation. So in terms of people coming out in the streets of London, as we have seen over the last few months, and committing offences by supporting a prescribed organisation, you will have seen policing step forward in London and make arrests. It does talk to the capacity and capability concerns. We in London, as a large force, or the largest force, have got the ability to step in and make large-scale arrests. But that comes at a cost, because every officer we bring into London is an officer we're taking out of the neighbourhoods, is an officer we're taking away from frontline policing, or we're bringing in colleagues from around the country, and every colleague that we bring from around the country is an officer that we're taking away from their communities. So we will always enforce the law. We will do our best to enforce the law. We will look generally at the protest in front of us and make arrests to the capacity and capability that we have, and then take those arrests through to prosecution where it's possible and practical.
Very helpful reply, thank you. Let's go to Afzal Khan, and after that we're going to hear from Mr. Tom Gordon, Member of Parliament. Afzal.
Thank you, Chair. Just perhaps building on this discussion. So what is the police response to demonstrations that may be non-violent and non-criminal, but are nevertheless experienced as intimidating by certain groups? Can imposing conditions on protests address these concerns without undermining the right to protesters, for the protesters?
Assistant Chief Constable Arms, why don't we bring you in first, and then colleagues can chip in as well.
Thank you for the question. It's really difficult to, I guess, give assurance that across the country powers and legislation are used consistently. Now, I don't say that lightly, so let me explain the reason why. You've heard from all of us today that our communities that we police are very different. We deal with many different groups, complex communities, and we all face different challenges when it comes to threat, harm and risk. One of the key things that we all do and we will do consistently is make sure that we engage with communities, we understand their concerns, we listen to them, their voices are heard, and we can act accordingly. In order to do that, we need to make sure that, and it is commanders, it's public order commanders at every level, apply consistency of the framework, of the legislation and of the guidance that is available to them. And we have seen, particularly the use of conditions in the capital, in London, where they have been put to good effect. They have helped policing, but they've also helped our core purpose of keeping people safe. Recognising it is really challenging when we are policing protests. We have to have a graduated response, because within the protest itself there will be different groups, there will be different voices, and we need to make sure that we can respond appropriately.
Thank you very much. Let's go to Assistant Chief Constable Wilson, if we may, to answer Mr. Khan's question, and then I want to bring back Mr. Sobel.
Yeah, so building on what Claire has just said, here within Merseyside, we actually use those conditions under Section 12 and 14 quite sparingly. We've used them in an exceptionally small number of scenarios, and often the higher risk protest environments where they do, and it has brought significant disruption. And again, whilst there are considerations about preemptive use of those conditions, what is really, really important is that commanders are able to evidence what is happening there and then to justify the use of those powers. And a key part of that is effective community engagement beforehand and understanding what a state of normality would look like for that community. I know we've spoken about the conditions, and whilst they're obviously an option, they are impactive. And again, it's that balancing act between respecting the right to peacefully protest versus respecting the right of others to go about their ordinary everyday business. And again, from a resource perspective, if you do impose conditions, you have absolutely then got to be in a position from a resource perspective to be able to police those conditions effectively. So just because they're there doesn't mean that they should or will be used, but they are used sparingly here in Merseyside.
Mr. Sobel.
So when protest groups seek permission to march past place of worship, it is not unusual for the worshippers to find that those groups can be intimidating. So when you go through a process of considering routes, how do you judge that those concerns in particular, which usually are vocalised well in advance of the demonstration, take place? Maybe Assistant Chief Constable Ames, this one for you. Yeah.
So it's very, again, I really don't want to sound negative, but I don't want to paint a picture where there is a lack of consistency, because we are consistent in a number of things that we do in policing. We have to, despite the large number of protests that we see, not just in the capital but elsewhere, ensure that each and every single one is assessed and policed in according to any threat or risk that is posed. What we will always do is seek to listen to the voice of the community, to understand the challenges, and to make sure that we do that in equal measure to everybody who wants to be heard. There are times when we may not get that right, because we may not have listened to somebody, we may not have heard them. I would say that we do our very best to make sure that we're able to, but we will have seen played out on social media, all of us in this room, the challenges that we face in those dynamic situations. And I come back to the point around making sure commanders are trained, they understand the legislation, they have got the confidence, because that is also a different matter. They've got the confidence and the courage to use the powers that are available to them. And what is really important when you are a Gold Commander is that you are communicating with everybody on that policing operation. You are listening, you are understanding what's going on in the ground through your Silver and Bronzes commanders. And if something changes, because quite often that does happen, as a protest will start out and we will have planned, we will have resourced, it will suddenly very quickly change, and that could be an atmosphere or risk. We make sure that we are able to adapt and respond accordingly. And I don't know, Claire, if you've got another example, but this is what we see on a regular basis now in the Metropolitan Police.
So obviously London is the capital city. When we think about the volume and the risk and dynamic, if I can take you back to the 28th of March, it was a Together Alliance demonstration, which was social justice groups coming together We also had a notification that Palestine Solidarity Campaign wanted to come out but started a different location but joined the main march. We had a notification of a counter-protest that was going to be carried out by Guard Javedan, an Iranian anti-monarchy group who wanted a counter-protest Palestine Solidarity Campaign. At the same moment in time, we had Palestine Action, who turned up outside New Scotland Yard, showing support for a prescribed organisation. And then we had a funeral service for the Ayatollah at the Islamic Centre of England with a counter-protest outside. So some of those events were spontaneous, but that's a snapshot, the day in the life of London, and you're trying then to balance the rights of protesters with understanding the needs of the community, the dynamics of the community, the concerns of the community, which are really important, and you've heard from all colleagues around here about the necessity for engagement, and it starts really early. So some protest groups will notify us, others won't. We talk to those protest groups that we know. We have good community links, both with protest groups and with the community. We use our police liaison teams to start that communication early, and as a Gold Commander, I would also meet with those groups. So we take those concerns really seriously, but as we've talked here about balance, there has to be balance about the right to protest, clearly without allowing anybody to intimidate another section of the community. But that is a snapshot of the day in the life of London in terms of how we balance all of those different needs and how we use conditions. And unlike colleagues in Merseyside, because of the volume and the extent of events that we have in London, we do use conditions to restrict the rights of protesters with a justified reason. We've used conditions since October 2023 around 188 times in London. That gives you the size and scale of how we've used conditions to restrict routes, to restrict times and start locations of events, to restrict end times, to restrict noise. And then I would follow that up by saying we then police those events. So as colleagues in Liverpool have described, we have conditions, we police the conditions, but we also use our own lawful powers. So our powers of stop and search, our powers of normal criminal offences that we would manage every day, hate crime legislation. We teach our officers to intervene and teach a protest that it's not just a protest, it's still a situation where crimes may be committed, and they've got all the legislation available for them to do that.
Well, thank you very much. I think for the purposes of our inquiry and report, you've made a lot of very clear observations about the challenges you face, but also some very helpful and constructive suggestions about what more needs to be done to help you in that very challenging role that you have of trying to balance these considerations. I'd like to move us on now, if I may, on to questions about intelligence gathering and facial recognition. These are questions that have troubled some members of the committee, and I'd like first, if I may, to go to my colleague Tom Gordon, Member of Parliament, and then bring in Baroness Hamwee.
Thank you very much, Chair. Obviously, there is a huge amount of work that will go into trying to assess the issues that will be coming with these protests as and when they are getting planned and underway. When you're gathering intelligence in relation to those protests, how do you ensure that you do that in a way which is both necessary, proportionate, and focuses on genuine risks of criminality or serious disruption, rather than just lawful participation in a protest in its own right?
So thanks for your question. I think intelligence is the basis of what we work on now in a modern environment. I think we've got a lot more ability to be able to gather that now, and we've definitely invested within policing on making sure that that is accurate. There's a lot of information that's put onto open forums, and obviously we've got intelligence officers who work on a daily basis, and I'm sure Kelly will add context to that in a second, but what they may have invested. But we've done that at a national level as well through our National Police Ops Coordinating Committee. I think that there's a distinct difference between different types of protest. We have got a team in the centre who look at nationally collating both regional feedback from intelligence purposes and also from feedback on community tensions monitoring also, and at particular times over particular issues we have to dial up the scale in relation to that. So examples being over recent times, obviously we've had some very high profile protests in the last month or so, which have happened in Hampshire and in Belfast, and that's been scaled across the country, and some of that protest has turned violent. So it's really important that we have to have monitoring really effectively intelligence there, so that we can coordinate the resourcing plans to adapt accordingly across the country to that. But do you want to talk about, if the Lord Dalton's okay, the Met's way of doing it? Or?
Briefly, if we may, because I'm just conscious that there will be a House of Commons vote a little later on, and we don't want to have to disrupt the committee proceedings if we can. But nor do I want to rush you in the excellent evidence you're giving us. I would just add the caveat that if there's anything that you don't feel has been said that should be said, then we will be very open to a written submission subsequently, and I promise that will be included in the evidence. But so let's go to the Met, and then after that, Lady Hamwey's got a question for you, and I'm going to bring in Mr. Gordon again after that.
Lord Dalton, thank you, and I will keep it brief, and we'll follow up with anything else that you may need. So, from a Met perspective, as the Chief describes, obviously the National Intelligence Collation is really important to the work that we do, but we have a bespoke public order intelligence unit that is our absolute focal point of where we start gathering our intelligence, and that starts with social media scanning. It starts with our protest liaison teams, it starts with our communities, so our local BCUs, so effectively what would be our boroughs coming together. We gather intelligence from all of those areas, and obviously we keep fastidious and accurate logs of that intelligence that we're gathering. We take our professional judgment from previous events and experience that we've had in London, and unfortunately, because of the nature of London and the numerous protests that we have a lot of experience with what's happened previously at an event. So we will bring all of that intelligence together, and then we will assess it collectively and understand what is it that we're dealing with, what are the threat, harms and risks, and how do we use that intelligence to decide on our resourcing and how we plan.
Can I just push a little bit further? I understand the concept of how you're describing how you go about it. The question I'm sort of getting at is more about how do you make sure that you're not, what parameters, what restrictions, what limits are on this to make sure it is a proportionate thing that you're doing. You mentioned monitoring social media. Is that on people who have already been flagged up as a risk, or are we talking Facebook groups where innocent people might be in there who what restrictions or what framework are you operating within?
So you will know that there are levels of authority that we need to utilise if we are doing any intelligence scanning that puts us into a private space or a covert space. So when I talk about the Public Order Intelligence Unit, that's predominantly what we would call open source scanning. So anything that's readily available on social media online that you or I could access, and we can see what's happening in those spaces. When I talk about audit trails and keep an accurate record of the intelligence products that we're looking at, how we are using those and how we are deciding that's proportionate or lawful or necessary to do what we need to do, that sits within those intelligence gathering models. As a Gold Commander, I would set a strategic intelligence requirement. So I would set out at the beginning my requirements for intelligence products to fit the event that I'm looking at policing, so whatever that might be. And then I would expect my intelligence gathering teams to start that process, working with the parameters of the legislation that exists about how we go about intelligence gathering, and working to the law on that basis.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's go to Lady Hamwey with a question about facial recognition, and then I'm going to come straight back to Mr. Gordon, if I may.
Which is developing very fast, of course. On a previous committee in which I sat, 2 successive Home Secretaries gave us great assurances that the human would always be in the loop in every use of facial recognition. I think the term the human in the loop should not be used any longer, frankly. It's rather misleading. And as part of the exercise that you've just described, I know you'll have a watch list to use on the ground, as it were, when facial recognition technology is deployed. How do you ensure that it's not going to have a chilling effect on members of the public who are exercising their right to protest when it's in use?
Constable, why don't you kick off?
Thank you, Lord Dalton. Thanks, Baroness. I think live facial recognition has got a lot of use, a lot of positive aspects to it, especially when you think about some of the violent protests that we have seen. It gives us the ability to have on a watch list certain offenders who we would not want at particular areas because they have a propensity to cause violence. I think every deployment of live facial recognition, I can give you this assurance, is very, very carefully thought about by the gold and silver commanders of that operation to make sure that it really is justified and proportionate in relation to the event in place. It has a lot of positives and a lot of benefits. I think the recent surveys that we've undertaken, I think over 80% of people gave feedback that they felt it was a very positive thing. But of course, like everything, it is a, people do have subjective opinions on whether things are right to use or not. So we revisit that regularly. It is rationalised and throughout the command logs when it is put into place. And there are parameters around particular areas and times where it would be used to make sure it was addressing the threat, risk and harm that it was actually there for.
And how do you get the message over to the public for things you've just been saying?
Yeah, I think that is a challenge, because there are people and there are certain groups who do feel that that's an infringement on rights and people's civil liberties, and we keep working on that and answering questions and trying to be quite open and transparent in relation to what we actually achieve out of it. I think there's more we can do, and it's an evolving piece of technology that has got more capability as time goes on, and we've got to be showcasing that so that we can keep the public buy-in in relation to it.
Thank you. I think the committee would also be interested to know about bias that can appear in facial recognition, and if you have anything on that you'd like to say to us in writing afterwards, I think we would be interested to hear it. But I'm going to go back to Mr. Gordon.
Thank you, Chair. So obviously live facial recognition technology is just one of the tools that you might use when you think about policing protests. I wondered what other tools, and if there's utilisation of AI in other ways that you use when either preparing intelligence gathering, thinking notably back to the issue that we had with West Midlands when there was the Tel Aviv Aston Villa football game and AI hallucinated in the preparing of that briefing and the whole fallout that we saw of that. So right now, are any of the police forces that you're aware of using AI when it comes to preparing briefings and intelligence gathering or policing protest?
So in relation to AI and the use of AI, I think it's a fantastic piece of developing technology for us, but as you've alluded to, has to be used very, very carefully. I wouldn't be able to speak on behalf of every force across the country in relation to the use of how you've just articulated. What I can say is that chiefs have been very, very clear in relation to the use of it. It does not replace the human aspect of things. So if you were to use elements of AI to put together any form of report, I'll come to intelligence separately, any form of report, that the human has to do the checks in relation to that. It can't be just left to an automated process, because that would be wrong. I get that the purpose is that there is capacity and capability issues that it says, but it can't be inaccurate in any shape or form over something which is so vitally important. In relation to intelligence, I'd be extremely reluctant to be reliant on AI in its sole entity. I think it's got some purposes for narrowing certain things down, but again, it cannot replace that element of human oversight. I don't know if Lord Alton wants to go to colleagues to give specific examples from other forces.
If they have a specific point, I mean, Assistant Chief Constable, would you like to come in first?
Thank you, Lord Alton. It was just to offer some reassurance. There is a time and a place for appropriate use of AI, but from a training perspective, we could not be clearer around the writing and the ownership of a gold strategy which will underpin the whole of the policing operation is written by the gold commander, and we're very clear about how that should be done without the use of AI, because that strategy contains outcomes, it contains strategic intentions, there will be a summary of information intelligence, powers and policy, all the things that you would expect to see. And that gold commander owns it right from the start of the policing operation right through to the end. And therefore they have to be in a position where they're able to defend that should it be subject to scrutiny.
Thank you very much. This is cutting edge, new technology. The next question, though, that Mr. Gordon's going to ask you about concerns some very old methods that indeed the first answer I'd like to hear from Assistant Chief Constable Wilson in a moment, because this is about stop and search. And I'm long enough in the tooth to remember that as a Liverpool Member of Parliament, at the time of the Toxteth riots and the Brixton riots, part of that was generated, of course, because of the overuse of stop and search. So let me not steal his thunder and ask Mr. Gordon to ask his question, and then we're going to go to Dr. Peter Swallow.
Thank you, Chair. And yeah, I think it was yourself, Detective Superintendent Claire Haynes, who mentioned stop and search earlier. But yes, stop and search without reasonable suspicion can be authorised when a senior officer reasonably believes a protest-related offence may be committed in a specified locality. Given that no individual suspicion is required, what are the safeguards that are in place to prevent this power being used disproportionately or having a chilling effect on protest?
Assistant Chief Constable Wilson first, and then we'll go to Assistant Chief Constable Arms after that.
Thank you. Yes, Chair, you are absolutely right in terms of your recollection, and we are still one of the highest users of stop and search, and it is a power which absolutely needs to be used proportionately, but is also a power that sends a clear message to people that if you are carrying weapons, if you are arming yourself, and this is outside of the protest arena now, when you talk about serious violence and knife-related criminality, that you can expect to be stop and search. Now, of course, as with every power, that power needs to be utilised properly. It needs to be properly explained. It's not just what you do, it's how you do it. And as well as being one of the highest users here in Merseyside, our find rates are highly positive, and we get a low volume of complaints and have a robust public scrutiny group wrapped around the use of stop and search. And I think also important to note, it's very difficult to quantify the success of stop and search legislation in terms of the prevention and deterrent elements. So they were a couple of points on stop and search. I think in terms of proportionate use, clearly within the legislation, there has to be authorities from certain ranks within policing. It is for a set of parameters, and we are really robust in terms of the profile of individuals who can fall subject to non-suspicion of stop and search, absolutely recognising the impact that that can have on communities. And again, it's advertised, we are open and transparent in the use, and have lots of independent members of either our independent advisory groups or members of the public that join us in open scrutiny of stop and search, including review of body-worn video. And again, that learning and debrief so that we can make sure that we're constantly learning and building that back into robust training to make sure that we get the balance right between keeping members of the public safe, but also maintaining and building trust and confidence.
Thank you very much. Assistant Chief Constable Arms.
Thank you, Lord Alton. And if I'm being honest to the committee, there's nothing further I could add, because my colleague has given a very eloquent answer to that, which I would replicate is the position in a number of forces around the country.
Well, thank you. If there are other points that people want to make subsequently, then please let us have that and we will include it in writing. But let's go to Dr. Peter Swallow now, if we can, on serious disruption prevention orders. And after that, we're going to hear again from Sir Desmond Swain.
Yes, thank you. So, as you will all know, serious disruption prevention orders were introduced in the Public Order Act 2023, and these can impose some very significant prohibitions and requirements on a person's future protest-related activity. I have some questions, if I may, about how that relates to people's Article 10 and 11 rights under the ECHR, but I think where we should really start is just to get an understanding of whether this new power is in fact being used. I think the committee is not aware of any examples at all of anyone actually, of any police force applying for an SDPO. Could anyone add any light to that? I see
Assistant Chief Constable Wilson was shaking her head.
Indeed.
So let's hear a voice from Liverpool.
Yes, so we haven't applied for one here within Merseyside, and as far as I am aware, the CPS have not applied for one either. We did have one case in which we were considering application for a serious disruption prevention order. However, we pursued prosecution for another substantive offence. So again, I think close liaison with Crown Prosecution Service and making sure that we pick the most appropriate route, recognising the impact that those orders can have in terms of restrictions.
And any of your colleagues here in the room would like to add to that?
Lord Alton, if I may please, just from a training perspective. So you are correct in your observations, Doctor, with regards to the use. And I recognise that there is more that can be done in this space. So at the moment, I'm currently working with the College of Policing to understand what that could look like, so we can make sure that commanders have the sufficient knowledge and understanding. And there is a further piece of work that we're doing in consultation with our colleagues from the Crown Prosecution Service as well.
I think I don't obviously want to go into individual cases. That wouldn't be appropriate. But I imagine that everyone around this horseshoe can think of a few individuals who we could imagine might undergo certain activities that could well, open them up to us if we had our way, wanting to see such powers be used to stop those activities. So I think it is surprising to hear perhaps that this, possibly very broad power exists, and no police force has since 2023 thought it appropriate, thought it the right tool in the toolkit to use. It's just Assistant Chief Constable Wilson, you mentioned there that there was a situation where you actually thought a different power was more appropriate. So if I could just broaden out and ask the rest of the panel, is the reason that it's not being used, you mentioned their training, which I take on board, is the reason that this power is not being used because it's the wrong tool in the toolkit, because other tools exist and they're better, or simply just because there are so many powers that are coming online and this one hasn't been sort of reached for yet, but absolutely will be helpful in the future? I know that's a very broad and difficult to answer question, but I think it's just helpful for us as a committee to understand when we are looking at these very wide-ranging powers. Detective Superintendent Claire Hayes, if I can tempt you to attempt to answer that possibly.
I think for us it's a mixture. I do think there is training that needs to improve from our perspective as a police service, and obviously we work closely with the college, the national leads, to improve that training, but equally in comparison to colleagues in Merseyside, we too have had instances, but there has been another route where the prosecution or the type of prosecution in conjunction with the CPS has been the right path for us to take because of the impact on them. I think as time moves on, they may become more relevant, as you've alluded to, in certain spaces. Certain individuals that we could probably think about in this room in terms of how these orders would apply. So I do think it's something we need to take away and look at, certainly as a police service and probably more broadly nationally. But I think at the moment we've been in a space where there is other legislation that has been more well used, more traditional for us to turn to, more legislation that we're familiar with and in its use and its success that we've reached to first.
Thank you. Let's move on, if we may, at this point, because the clock is against us, I'm afraid. But we're going to go to Sir Desmond Swain, and after that we'll hear from Alex Sobel, Member of Parliament.
In the dialogue that will precede a demonstration, how do you attempt to overcome the innate distrust of the police that will exist in some protest groups? To what extent is the operational plan red lines laid down, or are you prepared to negotiate and be flexible to accommodate the interests of a peaceful demonstration?
I'll start if that's okay. I think your question is very valid, Sir Desmond. The protest liaison officers are an absolutely essential role for us. They do that early engagement. They're able to really outline what would be acceptable outcomes to actually meet the objectives of what the protest attenders want themselves, whilst causing minimal disruption and not serious disruption. And I think that engagement is really, really true and truly had positive consequences for us. Protest liaison officers have been specifically trained. They have built up experience of working with different groups. and over time have built up that trust that you referred to themselves with the groups, because what's really important is what is negotiated in the build-up to an event is stood by cometh the hour in the delivery, and that ongoing dialogue is an absolutely essential thing for us.
If I may, please. Thank you for the question, Sir Desmond. We mustn't forget that the absolute bedrock of policing in our country is neighbourhood policing. And our neighbourhood policing officers on a day-to-day basis are working tirelessly within communities, feeding back information to us and supporting us in our strategic objectives. What we will all do, and I speak for my colleagues on the panel as well as Gold Commanders, is hold stakeholder briefings. You will probably be familiar with the phrase "no surprises," and by that we mean we are open and transparent in our communication. That sometimes does mean that we have to deliver difficult messages, but likewise it's important that we hear difficult messages as well, so we can reach a position where we're acting proportionately, legally, but also responsive way to the needs of the communities.
Satisfied? Thank you, Sir Desmond. Thank you, panel. Let's go to Mr. Sobel, and after that we'll hear again from Afzal Khan, Member of Parliament.
I've been an MP 9 years, and in that time we've had a lot of legislation relating to protest and public order, particularly since 2022. Has all this legislation made the way that you police easier? Has it reduced disruption, disorder connected with protest? Or has it made relating to protest activity more complex? Maybe starting with you, Chief Constable Harm.
Thank you, Mr. Sobel. I think it would be wrong for me to say easier and meant that protest has reduced, because the facts would belie that statement. What we've seen in recent years has been an astronomical increase in the number of protests over different things for a variety of reasons that we already talked on the meeting today. I think the legislation has had to come to Parliament for different amendments, as we've already talked about, with regard to rapidly changing scenarios and different tactics being used. You'll be more than aware that at the moment Lord MacDonald has been tasked with looking at the actual Public Order Act itself, which, as we know, is 40 years of age, and was written at a time where international things did not have a local impact. It was written at a time where macro was not going to micro as rapidly, and did not have any context for digital era or online activity. So the review that he's undertaken, the recommendations that he submitted through to the Home Secretary, are obviously under consideration right now by the government. The changes that have been made in the interim are based on the amendments to the existing Act, and they have been helpful to tackle some of those issues. I've already talked about some of those tactical challenges that they have addressed. But again, I'll go back to a little bit. They have also caused some issues too, because just because something's written down in an Act as a power, as colleagues have already said, it doesn't always mean that it is the right thing to execute it at that time, because the context of it and the area that it's being undertaken in and the capabilities of the staff on at the scene might well mean that it's not the right thing to do, or it's something to do retrospectively. So there is a little bit of a difference that happens, and policing gets criticised in relation to that aspect as well.
A visitor once asked, what are all the bells about? And was given the reply, it's just one of the prisoners trying to escape, which might not be appropriate given the witnesses that we have here today. But the bells mean that a division has just been called in the House of Commons. So my parliamentary colleagues from the Commons will have to go and do their duty. When they return, we'll be able to pick up where we've left off. But for now, I must adjourn this meeting with those words, order, order.
Our vote table is 3 votes.
Until there are 3 votes.